With the last of the outer perimeter defenses now being ripped to pieces in the Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, the PLA air assault infantry troops of a single company out of 4 that had now been fully landed at the recently secured LZ in the Bear Creek Golf Course, and having had dispersed and crossed the International Boulevard to take up their positions, now had a single company of their 4 holding positions along the car rental drive, one of the roads traverse the airport itself. This one ran east to west direction as it connected to the International Boulevard, which ran north to south and actually bisected the entire site in half from east to west. As the troops of the air assault infantry, backed up by their combat aviation company within their battalion, as the 2 air assault battalions from the PLA active duty 83rd Group Army's air assault brigade, specifically attached to the PLA 59th Reserve Group Army for the sole express purpose of carrying out this combat operation in the entire city of Dallas-Fort Worth, was now backing these forces up as both battalions took a side of International Boulevard, as the combat aviation companies, 1 per battalion, effectively lingered over top of their ground troops. As the transport aviation company, 1 per battalion, were bringing in the final companies of the air assault battalions, namely the 1 mortar company in each battalion, which gave ground-based fire support. The fighting along the car rental drive would wrap up by the time they formally arrived and were able to set up. Effectively, as combat engineer company, they gave the fight literal life. They tried to break through the LA line that had developed to the south of the car rental drive. As we go to the map, the combat engineers, having had held an elbow-like position in the defenses, as southeast defenses, similar to how the artillery firing battery from the 3rd of the 133rd held the southwest corner, that was the first unit to be destroyed by the combat aviation companies, 1 per air assault battalion, with their very powerful and advanced Z-10 attack helo gunships, backed up by swarms of HE warhead-equipped CH-901A loitering munitions that simply ripped these forces to pieces, clearing a landing zone in order for these troops to be safe, disembarked, and out and take up the south of the DFW International Airport premises. As to the east, all 4 companies essentially in place. 1 had moved up to itself. As soon as the American forces had been seen pivoting, and the real-time AI battlefield data processing system had alerted the local command of the battalion, who then ordered the company captains to move their forces into position along the road of this 1 of 4 companies, while another company sat further to the south on higher ground, and being on higher ground was able to fire over the heads of their own troops, or even through the gaps in their lines to give them heavy support, as a 3rd company effectively watched the road and the southernmost perimeter fence, while a 4th company, the 4th and final, moved even further south out to the main highway with which the International Boulevard connected at its southernmost end, outside of the airport grounds themselves. In other words, if the Americans really wanted to break through, even had they been able to get through this company, then they would have had to go through several others, but that was impossible because the combat aviation company and its firepower was simply far too immense to be able to survive. As paramilitary campsites that actually lay in between this map and the eastern map were the first to be hit by airstrikes from a pair of JH-7s, as there were 2 pairs of JH-7s, or 4 total of these aircraft, earmarked for this battle in the international airport from the JH-7 Strike Aircraft Squadron. There was also a pair of J-10 fighters and J-11 fighters equipped with extra air-to-ground munitions, as most of these fighters of both squadrons, earmarked just for the DFW battle, were only equipped with one pair of 1,000-pound laser-guided air-to-ground munitions each, while one pair of J-10s and one pair of J-11s from the J-10 and J-11 squadrons, respectively, were each given an extra pair of 1,000-pound laser-guided munitions, making a total of 4 1,000-pound laser-guided munitions per aircraft. As these 4 fighters, 2 J-10s and 2 J-11s, had moved in to assist the JH-7 strike aircraft, 1 J-10 and 1 J-11 in the eastern side had dropped all 4 of their laser-guided precision munitions on the firing battery holding this particular sector of the outer defenses, as they had pulled in their howitzers, their M109A6 Paladin 155mm self-propelled guns, with their Fast Vs and their FDC vehicles, their company captain, or battery captain rather, as it was an artillery battery, which is a company in artillery terms, and their headquarters forces. They were all badly annihilated, not only by the airstrikes, but precision artillery strikes, including 2 shells that weren't sanctioned by the AI system, but were overridden in terms of the AI system by the battery commander, the firing battery captain that ordered the firing anyway of the shells onto the runway, as this was explicitly prohibited. He disregarded and did it anyhow, just to destroy the fleeing headquarters platoon vehicles, including one of the MRAPs trying to flee in a more southeasterly direction, hitting them anyway, and being severely reprimanded and threatened with loss of commission for it. As 2 DH-10A long-range cruise missiles came in from the strategic missile forces across the border in Mexico of the PLA, namely from the bolstered 612th and 613th Strategic Missile Forces Brigades, as some of the reserve battalions were equipped with these missile systems. 2 would fly to the northern defenses and the outer defense perimeter, or Tactical Operations Center and campsite of the combat company of combat engineers defending this particular position on the approach into the airport, as this was the northernmost airport grounds, and the International Boulevard was effectively blocked off by makeshift barricades until something better could be effectively displayed. The assault came, the minefield was not either, with the M19 anti-tank mines, and 1 bunker that had been completed was hit by one of the 2 DH-10A cruise missile strikes, while the other was the TOC and the campsite of the headquarters platoon. As all of this firepower had caused the last combat engineer company to flee the scene, as they fled their fortified positions, making for the south, as they were attempting desperately to get out of the area and make it to other friendly forces, as they knew to their general south, the 3rd, the 144th, had some of its comprising combat companies present, including one that was only 2 miles to the south of the international airport, but was suffering heavily under fire at this time as well, and could not get to the airport, and vice versa, as these combat engineer forces could not leave. As the ground-based fire was withering away these forces bit by bit, as the vehicles were hit by attack helo gunship fire from 25mm chain gun fire, ATGM fire from both AKD-21s and HJ-08s, as 1 flying platoon was equipped with the AKD-21s, as in 4 gunships, and the other 4 were equipped with HJ-08 ATGMs, and all were equipped with the 70mm rocket pods, which they tried to conserve for any types of emergency situations where such firepower would definitely be required. Although they did not consider this too much of an emergency, 1 gunship had been sanctioned to fire its rockets at paramilitary forces trying to cross the road, only because these squads of this platoon had not arrived to patch up the gap yet, and thus they fired their rocket pods, along with there being 25mm fire and HJ-08 fire into this general area from this flying platoon, while these ground-based squads had interlocking fields of fire and fired at the fleeing paramilitary troops, while these QRF MAX Pro MRAP vehicles were destroyed in the airstrike from this JH-7, while J-10 and a J-11 flew south to join the strikes on the former sites that were previously occupied by this company as they hurriedly fled the area. As these different squads of this platoon, as this was a platoon with their 2 Bradley IFVs, one M113 APC and one M1150 armored engineering vehicle, these troops were simply mowed down by the ground and aviation-based firepower, as even on the hilltops, these forces fired through the gaps at these troops, and even in some cases were safe to and were sanctioned by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system due to its calculations over the heads of their own troops to hit American forces. As this retreat was mostly done in a very desperate and unorganized manner due to there being no effective communications. They tried in some cases to do half squad bounding covers where they would lay down fire while the other one bounded ahead, and then they would lay down fire and they would bound ahead, but they didn't get very far. And although they did cause some PLA casualties, as the American vehicles did have some heavy firepower, such as the Bradley IFVs with their 20mm autocannon and the 2 tow missiles each carried, as well as also the 50 cal M2 fire from the M250 cals that were on top of the M113 APCs. They managed to cause some KIAs and WIAs amongst the Chinese PLA troops that were holding the line, but the entire American combat company was simply decimated. The odds were stacked too highly against them. And also the remaining loitering munitions in the area that hadn't hit targets by the time the air and artillery strikes had, and even one missile strike from a DH-10A, had veered to the south and were joining in this attack as they struck American troops and vehicles with their HE warheads, which were enough to destroy most of the vehicle types present, except for the Bradley IFVs, as they required a heat warhead-equipped CH-901A to destroy them from the top attack. As all of this was unfolding, the logistical units from the headquarters and support companies of each armored battalion hurriedly raced in to conduct their logistical top-off operations because they wanted all combat forces completely topped off with ammunition and supplies for the final push. As this was a lightning-quick and very fluid operation, it was occurring in phases, but the phases blended seamlessly with one another in a quick, rapidly moving operations. As the forces on the western side were effectively shielded by the massive hangar buildings that were located in the general northwest that were now being cleared methodically by armored infantry troops, most dismounting from their vehicles and moving through before returning in their squads. The armored forces sat further back in positions a bit further away from the main terminal buildings, waiting for their orders to attack, while logistical forces with their supply the troops coming the headquarters platoons of each of the combat companies, who in turn received their supplies from the headquarters and support companies over the whole battalion. As the logistical support was distributed down the line from the headquarters and support company to the headquarters platoons of each company, the tanks were topped off with fuel and ammunition, as were the APCs and IFVs, and the combat troops inside made sure that they were green on everything in terms of ammunition, as they would launch their assault in a matter of minutes. As a logistical resupply operation, at least on the north and the western sides, would merely take, after the American defenders had been cleared from the area, it would only take an hour on the west and an hour on the north. But on the eastern side, they didn't have any such luxury because this was open ground between where they had stormed the outside perimeter and a mile of runway separating this outer area from the inner terminals. And they would have to cross this wide area in the open, but as they were conducting their logistical resupply operation, the vehicles had deployed their smoke They used their smoke grenades and effectively popped them out of their smoke discharger systems, which were the systems which held the smoke grenades on the tanks, like so, as well as also on the IFVs. And they had utilized these systems to create a smoke screen from behind which, as the wind was blowing approximately 5 miles an hour to the southwest, the vehicles could take turns discharging smoke, and all of it would blow back towards the Americans gradually, as also there was billowing smoke from a lot of the destroyed vehicles, obscuring view for the American defenders further towards the main terminal buildings as well. The logistical resupply effectively was hindered as a result, as although the Americans did try to take pot shots through the smoke, if anything, they only hit the berm, which was way far off behind the now placed armored forces and armored infantry, or if it was 50 cal fire, it effectively did nothing at this range to even the IFVs, which were the Type 89As, much less the IFVs, which were the ZBD-04As, and the main battle tanks, which wouldn't even scratch really the paint on. But the logistical forces were able to get in there, and even though the fire was sporadic and relatively mild, they were able to top off their forces, prepare them for their final push, which only came in 45 after the forces had cleared the outer defenses with their massive volume of loitering munition fire, which was 48, and again the rest of them veered south to assist in ripping apart the last remaining company, assisting the air assault troops and their gunships with this task. And the mortar companies, which were now at this time being brought in while the logistical resupply was going on, were landed at the LZ, which had been cleared, had cleared the area of burst of the American combat forces defending the outer defense perimeter. And as they spread out, one would remain with their battalion and the other would cross and join their battalion, set up their mortars. Their mortars would face towards the south while this battalion's would face north. And they, the mortar company freshly landed, would mostly help on the western side of the attack, as the 3 battalions would commit 5 combat companies to the final push. 2 tank companies would come from the battalion that attacked from the west. 1 armored infantry company, which was the one that moved in the space between this map and in the mile area, as well as also a tank company, which would be this one in the middle of all 5 companies, as 1 armored infantry, 1 tank, armored infantry, and a tank. These 2, the armored infantry and tank company, would come in and cross the no man's land to attack the final American defenses. As the anti-tank companies in each battalion, having had fired all 160 of their HJ-10 ATGMs guided by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, all of their munitions, along with all the loitering munitions that had been fired in the first salvos, had effectively all crashed into their targets roughly at about the same time as the artillery strikes had come in from the 35th Armored Brigade's Artillery Battalion of their self-propelled PLZ-05 155mm howitzers, as well as even the DH-10A missile strikes that hit in the east and the lingering. Only strike conducted and only satellite-guided air-to-ground munition strike, and the level of precision was such that it would mitigate any damage to the runways. As again, the reason why this entire assault even took several hours wasn't only because this was a large area, but it was also because of the number of defenders and their positions upon territory that the PLA wanted as much intact as humanly possible, meaning they wanted to mitigate or do very minimal damage to the runway and building infrastructure of the terminals. This was absolutely critical to the PLA cause in this particular battle, insofar as their objectives were concerned. Their overarching objectives essentially stipulated that this was to become the largest megafob in the entire region, in this part of the state of Texas, to accommodate local occupation forces post-victory in the invasion. And now, as the initial airstrikes, missile strikes, as there were limited cruise missile strikes again, and the tank shell fire, which was massive, as well as also the HJ-10 fire from the anti-tank companies, which was massive as well, and the loitering munitions equally so. The next salvo of weapons was being prepared as all three anti-tank companies, one per armored battalion, were reloading their AFT-10 systems at this time that the logistical resupply was going on, as well as also, again, the tanks were topping off their supplies, as well as the armored infantry troops for the final push, and the artillery would be on standby for this operation if needed, although it would be highly unlikely that they would even be used due to, again, the stipulations on what they could and could not strike. Same went for the aircraft, which, if used, would most likely be used in a strafing attack, apart from, again, using satellite-guided precision munitions or perhaps laser-guided. But again, only one airstrike would even be sanctioned in this operation, and it would be as a direct response to the loss of a PLA tank to a Copperhead round. It also has to be understood that even though these smoke discharging systems cut two ways, as in it not only obscured from view the PLA from the Americans, but it got in the way of PLA targeting technologies on the main battle tanks and other systems because the smoke interfered with infrared and laser optics and sighting, and it also basically obscured view. So indirect fire was traded between the Americans and PLA troops, but again, that was only on the ground-based forces, the main battle tanks, the Type 96Bs effectively, the heavy machine gun equipped Type 89As and the IFEs, the potent ZBD-04As, traded some indirect fire with the Americans, who fired back but mostly hit nothing. And as the final push was being prepared, the smoke had finally cleared for the most part on the eastern side, on the outermost perimeter where the outer runways were, and just beyond which was the berm beyond the outer service road. They now were charging across the open no man's land of nearly, again, a mile between the main terminals and the outermost runway system, and were firing while on the move. Again, they sent in one tank and one armored infantry from the east, holding the others back to support them from a distance. And very rapidly, the American defenders were being picked apart, although, again, they would manage to destroy two PLA Type 96B main battle tanks, which these were top of the line, some of the best main battle tanks in the world, although the Type 99A, which was even a step up from this, was arguably the world's best main battle tank, if not only due to its technical specifications alone. And now, as these Type 96Bs charged toward the airport terminals, they were accompanied by the armored infantry, whose task it would be to clear the buildings themselves. After, within the 45 minutes to an hour, that the not only AFT-10 systems had all been reloaded of each of the three anti-tank companies per each of the three battalions, the loitering munitions, the CH-901As, had since been reloaded by their combat drone sections and their headquarters and support companies that sat beyond the battle space, and they too would be fired in a fresh salvo by three attacking battalions, namely the three armored battalions. These would also come in and support the final push against the main airport premises. As the American defenders had been in relatively good positions, as they again were dug in, and one benefit they had in this particular situation in the center of the international airport was the fact that even to the PLA's own detriment, certain heavy weapons were just off limits, namely again airstrikes, missile strikes from tactical, ballistic, and cruise missiles, as well as also artillery strikes, unless, of course, again, it was on grassy terrain or earthen terrain. And again, only one airstrike would be sanctioned, and only as a direct result to the loss of one of their Type 96Bs by a JH-7 that was carrying a pair of Baidu or satellite-guided air-to-ground 1,000-pounders that would be dropped directly on this howitzer that will have destroyed as it charged across the open field. one of the Type 96Bs with a direct shot with a Copperhead anti-tank round, as the same would actually occur on the opposite side to another tank. The PLA would end up losing 2 tanks in this battle, as earlier, during the crossing of the berm onto the east side, they had already lost 1 APC full of an entire squad, as had they lost one of their ZBDO-4A IFVs full of a squad. So they had lost 24 troops in a single salvo of these 3 shells firing at the berm just as they were crossing, as these gun crews are very fast, but were immediately destroyed literally right after getting their shots off by the airstrikes and artillery counter battery fire and loitering munition salvos that were coming in. As now the forces in the west again committed 2 of their 3 tank companies that had originally attacked the outer perimeter. They were moving in, one in an L shape with its combat platoons, 4 of them, 5 tanks apiece, or effectively a total of 20 tanks. One was moving, one had curved and swept in from the south, now firing to sweep the area with mostly Frag T shells, the fragmentation tank shells, and some heat shells when they had direct hits on vehicles, as well as also some tungsten-based Sabo ammunition as well. Although they preferred to save those for main battle tanks, there were none in this area, and they could freely use those. They didn't have to hold on to those for any Abrams or anything like that. The mortar fire from 82mm mortars were also beginning to come in, and they were hitting the combat engineer headquarters platoons, bivouac site, campsite, and TOC for their headquarters platoon of their headquarters company, their main command elements right here. There was also the FDC set up for this gun line, for this part of the gun line, this firing platoon right here, the FDC vehicle, and the artillery batteries, M88 armored recovery and field truck were here, which also got hit by a mortar. The field truck was completely wiped out by a mortar strike, and the M88 was a bit more resilient, as it was more armored and it could take more abuse. It would be destroyed by loitering munition strikes, as more of these very surgical HE warhead-equipped loitering munitions came in to hit direct hits on these vehicles, like these LMTV trucks, which were for logistical resupply purposes in the headquarters platoon elements of these combat companies, or batteries in this case, as there was an artillery battery that held the inner defenses facing west, and one held the inner defenses in 2 widely split up gun lines, or platoons facing east. As this was a large area, this, from north to south, this map, was a nearly 2-mile by 1-mile map. This was a humongous area right here in the international airport. One from the east. From the north back, there are other companies and their other armored infantry company to hold the outer perimeter that they had just taken and consolidated and cleared the buildings of, sending in a fresh company of armored infantry that hadn't really been used yet, because as they came in on their outer pincer attack, they hardly expended any ammunition by the time the massive artillery strikes and loitering munition strikes had come in and hit these targets, along with all the tank fire that had come in at the time. And now they were being sent north to begin the terminals from the north, while the other armored infantry companies started in the south, as there were some more terminals just to the south off this map that lay in between the very base of this map and the exit of the international airport area right here, as there was roughly another half-mile of territory to the south of this particular base of this map. And as they now had their aircraft lingering overhead, just in case if they were needed for strafing attacks, one had been sanctioned to drop their satellite or ammunition, 2 1,000-pound satellite stations directly on top of this howitzer. Both hit with a very high degree of precision, blasting the earthwork in multiple directions and making a massive crater and fringing basically the edges of the runway, but it was nothing that couldn't be fixed. But the blast radius annihilated this fast V and even set off a slight chain reaction, and a large blast happened in this particular area. And although the Fast V damaged the edges of the runway that it was partially sitting on, most of the blast went outward and upward and a little bit into the ground. But because the base of the armored vehicle was an armored vehicle, it mostly deflected it mostly outwards, and the area could be repaired, more or less, was the point. As, again, they had lost one of their tanks while crossing. The other tanks, getting direct beads on the turrets of the howitzer that was just protruding just up over the earthwork, hit that and destroyed it with a heat round, which also made a large blast as it ignited the shells, as well as the Fast V right behind it, wiped out the troops. This group of vehicles was hit by loitering munition strikes. The armored infantry troops had broken out into one platoon, as this platoon had delivered their troops out of their vehicles over this area, while the two other combat platoons moved in, leaving behind their headquarters platoon a bit further off the map. As the runways extended further up, there was another roughly half-mile space between the top end of this map, the north end of this map, and this map right here, the outer edges of the runway. So there was space, effectively, for this company here to move through the area and basically sweep it. As they did so, again, they had dismounted one platoon while they sat back. Mobile fire support, IFV especially, using their ATGMs to destroy this howitzer while using 30mm autocannon fire to shred up this Fast V, this their 100mm may destroy this vehicle, while the heavy machine gun equipped APCs were ripping up these squads of troops to shreds. Now, some of the artillery troops, including their headquarters troops, were dismounted and were now trying to put up the best defense they could with small arms as the PLA troops got closer. As there, before the final attack, had been small trades of fire between American troops in the furthest north of this map, with the platoon that basically held facing south, held their position on the road, the main boulevard, the International Boulevard, while the other two platoons of this armored infantry company cleared the outermost buildings. There was brief trades of fire for about an hour while the logistical resupply op was going on there, before the additional armored infantry company was sent in on the attack. And again, loitering munitions were coming in, hitting sandbag machine gun emplacements, vehicle emplacements with their heavy machine gun equipped troops with HE warheads, as the HE warheads were enough to destroy light armored vehicles like MRAPs as they would crash down on top of them and wipe them out. As the FDC vehicle got hit by a mortar strike right here, as did these troops coming by, as repeated 82mm mortar strikes would come into the same area on some of their firing missions. And again, one hit this Fast V, completely annihilating it. All the tank fire was coming in at the same time. Again, it was not uncommon for multiple systems to hit multiple different targets, or hit the same target. As they were coming in and firing their frag T shells, they blasted all these troops, these paramilitary forces, before they could even get into this terminal. These were civilian airliners that had been derelict and just sitting there. Some of them still had the ramps attached. These were destroyed by mortar strikes, tank shells, all as these tanks were crossing the wide open, nearly mile-long runway system to get into the center of the defense area, and then they swept the area with shelling from their tanks as this platoon moved in and began to shell the entire area alongside of their tanks, shelling here. Again, they had lost one tank to a copperhead round from this tank company, just as one had been lost on the other side from a copperhead round from the tank company right here that was in the middle of all five companies. Armored infantry on the top, tank, armored infantry, tank. Well, this tank company here, one in the middle, had lost one of its Type 96B main battle tanks. As the entire tank company, again, there was a mile space, they spread out in their different platoons and they spaced themselves out as they went for this area. There was a lot of maneuver space for the armor to maneuver in as they crossed that 1 mile long, separating no man's land from the outer edges of both the east and west side, as they now moved in towards the center after clearing the last two American combat companies they would still have to go through all of these buildings and clear them of the remaining 200 paramilitary alphabet SWAT-like forces that were part of the motley crew of paramilitary filler units that helped the military defend this site, as well as the two headquarters companies of the both battalions, the Artillery Battalion, the 3rd of the 133rd, and the 156th Brigade Engineering Battalion, who not only had camps and talks set up outside, they had campsites for their firing, their gun lines, and for their headquarters troops, but they also had troops mixed with paramilitary in this parking garage, taking up sandbag positions, which were destroyed by loitering munitions, tank shell fire, and the armored infantry were going in and clearing 200 mix of mostly paramilitary. There were about 150 paramilitary in here and 50 military, and they were clearing this out. And then they destroyed this tank company from the east, as this tank company moving up the center came from the this came from the west. There were two tank companies that came from the west, this one attacking the outside defenses, and then this one sweeping up the International Boulevard. Over here was the armored infantry and the other tank company. And then in the north, again, was just one armored infantry company, but broken up into its platoons. One platoon here that dismounted all of its squads that were now moving through to clear the buildings, with also another platoon having had dismounted its squads in this area, leaving one platoon having had not dismounted, with these squads moving through from the second platoon, with the third platoon not having had dismounted as squads, but the last squad of the second platoon being dismounted in here to link up with 2 of 5 of its squads that were now moving through this massive terminal building. They were also joined by this rolling T formation from this platoon, which would make a total of 4 squads in this building, while this squad would wait outside according to building clearance procedures. And these vehicles were outside according to building clearance procedures of this tank platoon right here. So as they went through here, and they had their 2 other squads going through these buildings and this parking garage, as these buildings effectively connect to the parking garage, they can go in here, and then both could come through and clear these. And then they exited and exchanged fire. Before they exited, while they were still in the buildings, they exchanged fire out the windows with these 2 machine gun emplacements, while loitering munitions had come down and struck and destroyed these Max Pro MRAPs on a sandbagged roof of this parking garage, along with mostly headquarters company troops from the Combat Engineer headquarters company that were in this parking garage. And there were a mix of artillery headquarters company and Combat Engineer Headquarters Company troops in this building, numbering 80 total. There was about a platoon of each in this building, so 40 and 40. And again, outside were mostly the combat companies and their platoon headquarters that set up their talks, and the company headquarters talks as well for the headquarters companies over the battalions. So there was the headquarters platoons of the combat companies, and then there was a headquarters headquarters companies of the 3rd of the 133rd Artillery Battalion and the 156th Brigade Engineering Battalion, who were also here. So this was a relatively large number of troops, all things combined. I mean, in total, it was about 500 troops and 200 paramilitary, so the defenders numbered 700. So as the outer combat troops were being destroyed by the tank companies and the armored infantry, one clearing the buildings in the south and one clearing from the north, with one tank company even moving up through the center to demolish any fortified areas like this emplacement, the sandbag emplacement right here that had an MRAP in it for like a checkpoint. It was also hit by loitering munitions and tank fire from a heat round that sent sailing into it and blasted it. This emplacement was already destroyed by tank fire coming in from this tank platoon and this tank platoon as they moved in. Again, the aircraft were conducting their patrols over the air. They were lingering in the area in case needed for maybe strafing, but again, as the forces got closer into their final objectives, that would become unnecessary because it would then become too dangerous potentially, because all the forces were now in not only on the outsides of the terminals, but now they were entering the midst of them as well. Moved through, they simply just blasted these vehicles each time they moved up. And as the armored infantry vehicles of these two platoons worth of vehicles moved in, they too levied fire on these troops that were fleeing out of this parking garage. They simply got mowed down as they were trying to flee the area. As this green arrow encapsulated in red indicates, troops were destroyed by mortar strikes, as mentioned, loitering munition strikes. Even before these troops finished clearing this building, loitering munition strikes hit these sandbag emplacements. As loitering munitions would also hit these, they wouldn't even get to fire at these two squads that cleared this parking garage after these two buildings right here on the ends that are also connected to the parking garage. These two squads that came out of the lead platoon. Remember, the third platoon behind this platoon did not dismount any of its squads, and the lead platoon would dismount its last squad to link up with two of its squads that were clearing this building. As this rolling T came from this squad, it would stay in this terminal building and hold it down. As these two squads on this side here were also of the same platoon that this squad and this squad and this squad came from, all five of these squads came from this platoon. These two squads, this one would enter there with this squad going in this way after this had been cleared by loitering munition strikes. These troops had been already wiped out by fire coming from the main battle tanks. As they crossed, they fired their heavy machine gun turret and coax fire and mowed these guys down, because this was the ramp where aircraft could cross between runway systems as they went over the actual boulevard. These were like bridges for the aircraft themselves. And as they moved in and cleared this area, this squad would stay on the outside, although it wasn't really necessary. They stayed on the outside because they wanted to make sure that all these forces were wiped out before these two squads proceeded to move on. And then they would effectively join them and move into this building where there were 80 troops, or two full platoons, to contend with. Even as this was going on, these troops in here were trying to fire out at these tanks, and these tanks were firing back at them. They were doing absolutely nothing to the tanks. They fired some AT-4s at them out of the windows, but it really didn't do much because the Type 96B has phenomenal armor as base armor beneath its either NERA or ERA applique armor kits, so it really didn't do anything to these main battle tanks, which promptly fired frag T shells, but mostly responded with also heavy machine gun fire from their 12.7mm heavy machine gun turrets, like so, from their which was effectively beside their 7.62mm, and they mowed these guys down. So even when these three squads went in, they didn't even have the entire 80 to contend with, because many of them that were firing those in the ports for the flights wiped out by the fire from the main battle tanks. Frag T shells were tolerated. They mostly created a lot of shrapnel, although they did blast. The blast wasn't such to where it would do like enormously severe damage to the structural integrity of the building, so it was tolerated. And also it has to be remembered, the outside forces were also being hit by these long-range ATGMs that had a 6.2-mile range, which is very long range for an anti-tank guided missile, coming in from the AFT-10s of the three anti-tank companies that had freshly reloaded while they're online armored for conducting their logistic supply. So now, at 68 HJ-10s a per company to fire at these forces, all of it ISR directed through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system. Target emplacements with loitering munitions and mortars on the western side wreaked havoc. Logistical is the PC of this gun, and also headquarters troops and more, and combat troops as well. As over on this side, loitering munitions, tank shell fire, heavy machine gun fire from the tanks, as well as coax fire from the tanks, and the armored infantry now moving in to clear this 200-strong garrison inside this building on the very southern edge. One company of armored infantry, again coming from the section between this, they moved in and they cleared these buildings immediately to the south. They went straight in and cleared these buildings. And as the tank company from the west rolled south of their forces and came up International Boulevard, they literally rolled into the heart of the defenses. And now there was literally nothing that could be done about it. As these troops tried to retreat, they were cut down savagely. And then they would stop here temporarily until these vehicles up a bit more to provide covering fire into the layers, the upper floors of the parking garage. The top floor had been cleared by these loitering munitions and the HJ-10 strikes. They had completely cleared the top of the parking garage, but the floors inside had to be cleared by these squads of troops that were these two squads that would be backed up by their lead vehicles of their armored infantry as they rolled down International Boulevard southbound, while the tanks rolled up International Boulevard northbound, and eventually they would pull up to basically provide fire into the garage as well, just like these vehicles could. And the rest of the forces that didn't surrender were all annihilated in this building. The forces in here, the what was left of the original 80, they would gradually be basically whittled down by the combat, the exchange between the tank platoon that they were fighting and the ones that tried to fire out at them and to defend the building. They were wise, at least, in understanding. This squad got mowed down trying to get in the building by the tanks. They were wise in understanding, those that were already inside, that the PLA didn't want to destroy the building. They wanted it in as much intact as possible, but they were severely cut down by the hail of fire from the heavy machine guns on the tanks, as well as the coax fire, and even the occasional Frag T shells when they were sanctioned for use. And as these three squads went into the building, they effectively to some combat in the open terminals and waiting areas, as well as even in the food courts and shops, the security zones, the check-in counter areas, the counter area become combat zone as well. The whole thing, brutal. I mean, they would break into their different tactical formations, whether by a single squad breaking into half squad, stack team-like elements, or whether it be two full squads working together. It would all depend on the building layout and other factors like what types of threats were in the area, the building layout, the number of troops that they had and were using to clear the building with, and so on and so forth. And all of it coordinated by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system. The fight over the DFW International Airport was indeed a very intense battle. It was a massive effort as it involved some 5 battalions from 2 different brigades working together from heavy to light, as the light was the air assault battalions, the 2 of which that blocked off and cut off the retreat, which was basically a brilliant way of using these resources, while the heavy forces came in and conducted the main assault. As they now viciously cleared the remaining security elements from the area, the 2 armored infantry companies succeeded in flushing all the terminal buildings after the tank companies and some of the armored infantry forces that moved in with them assisted in clearing the external threats, namely the 2 firing batteries. Although they lost 2 main battle tanks doing it, the fighting on the outskirts of the inner defenses was mostly a vehicle affair. The PLA really didn't dismount any troops other than the squads of 1 platoon that was already out clearing these buildings before they brought other squads closer in and dismounted them. 2 into the center, 2 into this building, 1 into this building of the final squad of the lead platoon to link up with 2 squads of their own platoon with this squad here, this rolling T that originally went in, holding this building. Again, this squad would remain outside, but this was after their own platoon vehicles had already liquidated these defending forces with their troops assisting in this, because they suffered some minor injuries, but nobody was really wounded or anything like that. I mean, they suffered some minor injuries typical of these type of operations, but nobody was wounded or even grazed by any ammunition. I mean, they took a few hits to their body armor, but that was about it from small arms, and that basically just gave them sore ribs. But other than that, they didn't really lose any of their troops, at least until they got into the building that had 80 people in it and into the southernmost building where a whole other armored infantry company was assaulting. As they cleared this building of troops, they would AIA and building they would suffer about 4 in the one that had 80, but they would succeed and they would successfully clear the entire airport.